Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the podcast show where I interview the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by someone who I've been following for quite some time, actually, on LinkedIn. His name is Joseph McGuire, and we're podcasting today with him being based over in Ireland, to talk about the art of facial recognition and how he's been able to utilize this in his business career to date. Joseph has had multiple decades worth of experience working with various different businesses. He's worked in complementary therapy for 30 years, having trained in London and begun a practice in Hamburg. I'm very excited to talk to him today about the practice of Mien Shiang, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, which is the 3,000-year-old Chinese tradition of facial recognition and face reading. Welcome to the show, Joseph.
Thank you, Leila. My pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much for being here. And tell me and all of our listeners who are tuning in today to the podcast a little bit about you and how you came to be where you are today, which is doing quite an unusual job role, I would say.
Yeah, I'm the only one in Ireland that I know of doing it, certainly outside the confines of traditional Chinese medicine. For me, I guess, as a very small child, I was reading people. And I could intuitively, like I can remember sitting on the floor as a toddler in my parents' home and knowing that I knew a lot about the adults around me, especially the men. Like women still remain one of the great mysteries. But men were to me like an open book. And then when my father introduced me to, my father brought me to, excuse me. My father brought me to football matches as a small child, and I could see patterns developing. I could see where people were going to go before the ball came, all that sort of stuff. And I just assumed everybody was doing it, which they obviously weren't. So I was intuitively picking up on a lot of non-verbal stuff and a lot of what people weren't saying, particularly in terms of who was faking it, who really had the confidence that they were portraying, who was hiding things. I just knew a lot of stuff like that, but I couldn't have said, as I said, how I did it. But then many years later, when I moved to London, I started to study and I was introduced to face reading. I was introduced to it initially as a diagnostic tool. But the Chinese perspective has always been that the mind and the body are one inseparable unit. So when I was introduced to this, it was like just light bulbs going off because it gave me a structure. And so I was studying 3-4 nights a week and weekends, and then I was working with one of my teachers in his health food store. So as soon as somebody would come into the store, he would ask, okay, what's his condition? What's her condition? So it was really full immersion. And it just connected for me. It was like I'd found a purpose. I found a clarity of direction, I guess. And when I moved to Hamburg then, I started to practice, and I was teaching. I trained as a shiatsu practitioner initially, and I was practicing and teaching shiatsu, but I started to teach workshops in facial diagnosis, but I just brought more and more of the mind, emotional, personality, behavioral stuff into it. And although I was teaching it to healthcare professionals and have taught it to healthcare professionals since 1985, I was more and more fascinated by what I was seeing in terms of the personality and the behavior style, the stress triggers, stress responses, life history stuff, parental influences, grandparental influences, life responses. And I found I was able to provide insights to people into their own life and how their past has influenced them, but how their present isn't governed by their past equally, because that's one of the traps we tend to fall into. X has happened, so therefore it must happen again, or I must be stuck, and etc., etc. So I found I was able to help people bridge the gap and get a different perspective that connected them more and more with their own strengths. And I was teaching. I was doing that in my personal consultations, and then a few years ago, my body just said, can't do the therapy stuff anymore, because I found that quite a bit of what I was doing was hands-on, And as soon as I would touch somebody, I would pick up on a lot of what was going on underneath whatever the physical condition was. I would pick up on a lot of their emotional, mental stresses, and I was just on some level absorbing it. Plus, I had my own life challenges, which were ongoing. So at a certain point, my body just said, enough. So I was aware that various people in the US had been using this in business for communication, interviews, team building, mediation, added skills, sales training, etc. And I decided to road test it as a business tool here. So I've been gradually building it up, and now thankfully I'm making international connections as well. I'm doing work on and offline. So some of my online clients are based in various other countries as well as Ireland. So in essence, that's the journey.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And I guess, like you say, you didn't set out to do this, but actually it's almost been an organic journey, hasn't it? You've started off as a young child, started to spot all these various different pieces, and then the journey is kind of folded out through the various paths from, working on more of the healthcare side into now applying this to business. There was something, if you don't mind me asking, you said something so interesting there when you were having kind of a difficult time in your life, and actually you were kind of, where you touch someone and actually you can feel their stress and their emotion. And I'm sure that people who are tuning in at the moment kind of get that, because when you're wanting to be more kind of, listening and empathizing and everything like that, but actually, as a practitioner in health, I've always wondered how do practitioners or psychologists deal with it, because surely they're absorbing all of that into their own self, and they might even, I don't know, need a psychotherapist themselves.
Well, I've certainly come across enough. I treated a lot of therapists from all walks of life, from medical consultants to the most way out complementary people, and a lot of them weren't taking care of themselves. It's like the mechanic having the worst car, etc. The cobbler's children having the worst shoe. All the old cliches. And I would have known therapists, again, of various backgrounds, who became seriously ill and in some cases died. Absolutely.
Oh my goodness.
But equally, I've come across therapists who are so blocked. They're not dealing with their own stuff at all, and they create barriers between themselves and their clients, and they keep it on a purely clinical, intellectual basis. But then when their clients or their patients came to me, I could see their patients were, in many respects, just being brought round and round on the hamster wheel. Mm-hmm. That they weren't really being helped. They were being brought back time and time and time again. And they were continually being brought back to revisit whatever their trauma was, but they were never getting through the trauma or, through it and beyond it, which is really the whole point of it. And one of the things I have learned myself, and because particularly through the help of one of my mentors, is that when we have stuff, I just put it as generally as that, in the past that has impacted on our lives, when we're looking back on it, it's only just information, and it's really, what can we learn from it? Is it of use to me now? Is that lesson of use to me now? And how can I take it forward in a way that enhances my life and hopefully enhances the lives of others?
It's a really interesting point that you make there, because it's almost like this juxtaposition between wanting to, as a human being or a business leader, who are the types of people you're dealing with right now, is to be able to listen to your team and listen to others and be able to empathize with them, yet at the same time, also wanting to make sure that you look after yourself enough that you aren't giving so much of yourself and your empathy, almost, you know what I mean? That you're still able to function properly as yourself and perform optimally. I mean, what would you say to leaders that are tuning in who are trying to get that balance? Because I personally find that a real challenge. I want to listen and empathize, but I've got my own issues to deal with, and you kind of
course.
How do you do that?
Well, life is increasingly busy. That's one of the things. So we have to prioritize. We have to prioritize our time. One of the things I've learned, and I'm continually learning. I have to be. We all have to be, and we have to be learning about our own processes, our own habits, our own patterns. And sometimes we reach a plateau or a roadblock even metaphorically speaking, where a pattern or a habit of ours has to change and has to go because it's impacting on us. So one of the things is to listen to the body, tune into the body, because the body is a very powerful teacher. And if some issue or pattern is coming up in the body, particularly if it's a recurring pattern, it's telling us something about ourselves, that we're off track in some way. The individual body will tell us in which way we're off track. And there are many modalities we can use, like NLP, hypnotherapy, etc., guided journeys, imagery, which I would use a lot, which will help us connect with the wisdom of the body. So that's certainly one thing. Another thing as a leader is to delegate. And sometimes we don't trust the people enough to do what they're there to do. Sometimes they're the wrong people. And if they're the wrong people, then we need to be clear that it's not good for us, it's not good for the organization, and it's not good for them to be there. So either find a place for them, or we need to move them on. That's just the reality. And we need to be clear in those choices early on. We need to set aside time. We need to prioritize time to take care of ourselves. And that, when I say take care of ourselves, that does the obvious stuff like diet, exercise. I do recommend meditation, but also doing things that are purely for pleasure. And whatever that involves for the individual. Obviously, that doesn't involve harm to themselves or others. But there's some very basic things, but it's being very, very clear on the priorities for our own well-being, because as if we're leaders, we have to model those qualities. We have to model vitality. We have to model clarity. We have to model enthusiasm to the people we're working with, and the people, and that's not just the people who are like our employees, colleagues, etc. It's our clients and potential clients, because so much of what we convey, so much of what we communicate is nonverbal, and our presence is often what attracts people to us more than the words or the technicalities of whatever the service or product.
Absolutely. I mean, you're completely right there. And if we're feeling as leaders, feeling weary or feeling stressed or feeling anxious, I guess you can read that across someone's face.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
Customers will be able to, other work employees will be able to, more and more so, as we are doing today, doing a video call across Zoom, and we can see one another when we're in different countries. Actually, you are attracted to people who give you that kind of that zest for life and that enthusiasm. You can see that they're genuinely thriving as opposed to suffering, I guess, perhaps internally, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually gave a presentation yesterday, and it was basically about visual facial cues for communication. And one of I tend to focus a lot on the eyes, because the eyes ultimately convey more information than any other facial part or body movement, etc. And one of the images I used was of Theresa May's eyes. And you could see during the time for premiership, she was increasingly tired and worn out. And you could see the progression. And you could see it was increasingly a massive strain for her, physically, mentally, and emotionally, to be in the role, which, and particularly, I suppose, exacerbated by the fact that she was initially a Remainer. But you could see the progression there. And she was a classic case of somebody who didn't have the vitality to convey a convincing message, or to bring people on board, because her vitality was just going down all the time.
Absolutely. And I guess, what advice would you have given to Theresa May had she had said, Joseph, I need some help here. I need some help here with Brexit, which, of course, is the current theme of, it seems to come up in every conversation at the moment, worldwide. I'm sure it is on everyone's lips. But what advice might you have given to Mrs. May when she was going through the traumatic time from being Prime Minister, of course, to then stepping down?
Okay, if I had a client in a situation like that, I wouldn't give them advice. I would, well, not initially. I would be asking them questions. The first thing is, how do you feel? How does your body feel? Get people to tune into the body, because so often people in situations like that are completely out of touch with their body. They just push and push and push, and it becomes like a pure habit to keep pushing, and they're operating. It's almost like there's a remote control pressing the buttons, and they're just, they're just continuing because that's what they do. So the first thing is to get them to tune into their body, and then to ask them why they're doing what they're doing, what's important to them, and get them to connect, if they're willing, with their own values. So it's not really, I don't think it's a case so much of advising them as firstly asking questions and getting them to connect, with what's important for them, and facilitating them in becoming clearer in their own choices. And somebody in such a high pressured situation where they're being assailed on all sides. And the reality is, we know politics at that level is a vicious business, and it has been for centuries. Like, if you look at, I don't know if your listeners would have watched the film Lincoln, with where Daniel Day-Lewis played Lincoln, and you saw how dirty politics was then, and that was an accurate portrayal of how dirty it was, and that's not anything new either. So you're not there in politics to make friends, which makes life even more difficult. So you have to also then advise them to focus on the relationships that are close to them and that are nurturing them. You have to advise them, I think this is getting into the bit of advice rather than the questioning, advise them to take time away from the situation. And that's one of the mistakes people often make. They become so immersed in terms of their time in the situation that they don't take time to step away from it, because time away from it often provides the clarity. Time away, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally, because we need to recharge. And doing something different in the routines. Like, for example, Steve Jobs was a huge fan of walking meetings. So walking meetings would be one possible example, but having time away where you intentionally and consciously switch off allows us to recharge physically, mentally, and emotionally. So that's a very roundabout answer to your question, but I'd be more questioning than advising in a situation like that.
I think that makes sense. What you're saying is essentially when we get so immersed in these issues, emotions and feelings, and I think we've all been there. I think every one of our listeners who is tuning in right now will be thinking, I can feel a time where that's happened, where you can't effectively see the woods for the trees because you're so immersed in a situation. And, of course, the second emotion gets involved, things can often get even more cloudy, so to speak. And I was trying to think of the name of the Netflix show when you were talking about Lincoln, which I've not seen, but I've heard lots of good things about actually. But I can't remember the name of the Netflix show which I was watching. It was a series, and it had the blonde lady with the short hair in, Claire. Can't remember her last name now, but it was fantastic, and it was talking through and reenacting all of the kind of dirty tricks that were going on in the White House, basically. I mean, of course, it was all fictional, but
of course,
you did think to yourself when you're watching it, I wonder how much of this actually happens behind closed doors. I think no one envied Theresa May in that position.
No, and it's universal. It's universal. Like Eisenhower famously said, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. And he knew what he was talking about.
I have to say, I'm dying to ask Joseph, and I know this is all very much about, the facial recognition and clear communications and everything like this. But since we are on Zoom, I'm going to ask you the question. So I'm sure all of our listeners are wondering, I wonder what my face says about me. Are there any specifics that you notice as you and I are talking? For those that are listening in, by the way, on the Apple podcast, we're on a Zoom call actually at the moment. So we're both on video call, so we can see one another pretty clearly, as is the wonders of modern technology. So it isn't just a pre-record purely on the phone or anything like that.
Yeah, just that I'm kind of like Columbo. You know Columbo, the old TV detective, where
Yes,
he's
just one
leaving
more
the room.
question.
Yeah,
Just one
yeah.
more. Just one more question. Yes.
Yeah. And for me, once I get started, there's always one more thing. But a number of things jump out. Your face shape is essentially oval, which means diplomacy is actually one of your innate strengths.
Oh, I'm writing all of this down. I hope you don't mind.
And harmony in your in the atmosphere, the environment is really important to you. And that would apply in your home environment, your professional environment. So if people are being stressed or agitated, or particularly if they're being aggressive, that does not suit you. It's not that you can't deal with it, but it's stress. It creates an internal stress where you work best when things are working with harmony. So that's the first thing. Your eyebrows, I know women tend to shape their eyebrows, but we work with what's in front of us. So your eyebrows are quite curved. So for you, building relationship is important. Quality of relationship, quality of communication, quality of connection is important. Not just connection, but quality of connection. Very important. And loyalty is also something very important to you. And that works both ways. So there are people who will assume they know you well, but there are probably very few who really know you well. But they're long-standing relationships that are proven, again, both ways. So when you make a commitment, that's really important to you. And if the other side of, if the other half of the commitment doesn't stand up, you're likely to call them on it. Because it's just too important. You've made a commitment, and you're not just going to commit for the sake of it, because you value your time, you value your energy, you value who you are, and that's perfectly reasonable, because we should all do that. You have a capacity to. I mentioned the diplomacy, and I mentioned the harmony, but you also have a capacity to be very clear and very clinical with people, and to let them know exactly what's going on.
Hopefully that's a good thing.
Oh, absolutely. None of these things are inherently good or bad. And that's part of the Chinese perspective, that everything contains the seeds of its opposite. So it's really a case of identifying our strengths and how best to use them. And in this case, people could take you for granted by assuming, because harmony is important to you, because your first preference is to be nice to people and to get on well with people, people could assume you're a soft touch, which you're not. So if people took you for granted, you'd be very well capable of speaking up and say, hey, whoa, there's a line here, and letting them know exactly what's going on. And I would be recommending doing that, because that is one of your strengths. To be willing, not just to be able, but to be willing and able to be clear and direct and upfront with people, because it lets them know what your values are. It lets them know where they stand with you. It lets them know what's expected, and then they either live up to that or they don't.
How fascinating. I can't believe you can tell that all from my face. And actually, I think pretty spot on, Joseph, pretty spot on. And for our listeners who are thinking, oh, I wish Joseph could read my face also, tell me in a nutshell about the art of Mien Shiang, and I hope I did pronounce that correctly before, because I know this, and looking at me, of course, I mean, I am Chinese, but as I've said in a couple of the shows before, I was adopted by wonderful British parents, and have been brought up actually in a very, I would say, Western way. So when it comes to Chinese culture, my other half knows far more than I do, because he lived out in China for many years, and I know you're close to the studies. But tell us, what is Mien Shiang about, in a nutshell, and how might our listeners who are tuning in be able to start having a read of other people's faces in their day-to-day lives, their boss, whether they're telling them something that they don't want to know or do want to know or such?
Sure. Okay, well, you're probably as close to the pronunciation as I'm likely to get, because I know there are so many niceties and fine details, fine tuning to the pronunciation of Chinese words and names. I'm told it's Mien Shiang, but I probably got that completely wrong myself, and apparently it translates as face reading. And it's a 3,000-year-old tradition, and the understanding is that our facial features reveal a huge amount of information about personality, behavior, style, etc. We can look at YouTube videos. There's a lot of information on pretty much any topic on YouTube. I do have a book, which I should mention, of course. That's a brief book. It's a brief introduction to the topic, but it's practical and informative, called Face Facts, The Art of Reading Your Clients and Prospects for Sales, Negotiation, and Recruitment. Plug. But there are also various blog articles on my website. There are people I would recommend as well, that I've certainly learned a lot from, that some I've studied with directly, some I just watch their videos or read their articles. So that there are many free sources available, first of all, on the internet, and I've no problem about giving away free information, because there's never an end to what's available, or to what one knows, or what one can learn. So starting point would be, I guess, look at my website, contact me, and I'm happy to share information with people. There's informative blog articles on various facial features, what they read, how they, what the information is in features of different shape, size, etc. If people are interested, the book is available through the website. They're starting points, but as I say, I'm happy to share information about other professionals as well, because people contact me from all parts of the globe, and if somebody is more local, I'm happy to share, spread the word with my peers as well.
Very good. And I think this is so important actually for business of today, as we watch the world grow and digital becomes ever, increasingly, prolific across the globe. Actually having those real those personal connections, and those relationships with people is incredibly important. And so, our face, it does say a huge amount about us. And so if we can foster that emotional connection and really understand, I suppose, as you said, what our customers are thinking, feeling, and really, try to, get, I guess, as much of that from their face and their body language as we can, the better we are able to build those relationships and, of course, do business.
Absolutely. And despite the digitization or digitalization of so much business, so much success in life, professionally as well as personally, is based on relationship and getting our communication right. And the fact that we may be exceptional even at our service, or describing our service or our product, doesn't mean we're getting our message across to the people we're speaking with or communicating with in the way they need to receive it and process it best. So this is a very powerful tool for recognizing what is the communication style of the person we're speaking to. How do they best receive information? How do they process information? Some people are much more linear thinkers. Some people need it in a very structured way. Some people need it in a more abstract form. Some people need it like bullet points. Some people need vast volumes of information. Some people need it quick. Some people need it slow. It's easy to pick up on those things from facial features. Like one person I worked with some time back, who was an accountant here, and I pointed out that her eyebrow shape told me that she needed people to give her information in bullet points. And she stopped for a moment and said, "Oh, I thought it was me being stupid, because I was just letting people talk and talk and talk, and I was feeling overwhelmed." So when she stopped people talking and said, "I just need the information in small chunks," it transformed her business. She told me she was literally getting new clients every day because she changed how she was letting them communicate with her. So there's an Oscar Wilde quote, which I love, which is that Britain and the United States are two countries divided by a common language. And the fact that we're technically speaking the same language doesn't mean we're processing the language in the same way. So recognizing how our clients, our prospective clients or candidates need to receive the information is vitally important.
I think that's very, very true indeed. And it goes back to, well, actually, I guess the name of your business, it's Clearsight Communications. We may be speaking one language, but at the same time, we could be meaning very, very different things. And so tapping into those other facets is going to be very, very important. And I guess just before we wrap up for today, Joseph, I'm going to give you, and for those that have listened to the show before, we tend to sometimes do a kind of a quick fire lightning round at the end. So before we run out of time, I'm going to give you 30 seconds for each of the questions I'm about to ask you, and then just summarize some of the key pieces of learning, because I think it's been very insightful and I've thoroughly enjoyed having my face read as well. And I'm sure our listeners would love to do the same. So I wonder, Joseph, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you?
Yeah, that's something that's very close to my heart. My younger sister has Down syndrome. My nephew is African American. My children are Irish German. Most of my friends here are non-Irish. When I was growing up, and I'd bring a girl home, the first thing my mother would ask is, "What's her religion?" I have no idea what religion or whether most of my friends are religious or not. It's irrelevant to me. I've lived in 4 countries so far. I've worked with people from so many different backgrounds and cultures that I almost don't think about diversity, because it's just, for me, people are people, and it's about connecting with the person. And I don't have, to me, the idea of not including people is just bizarre. And there's such a richness when we have a diversity of backgrounds, cultures, genders, even ages. There's such a rich mix, creative mix, inspirational mix, that to me it's just such a vital part of daily life.
Because you went over my 30 seconds, I'm going to give you one more question. Well, you actually answered another, because you gave that wonderful Oscar Wilde quote before. So I shall ask you one more, and it's probably quite an easy one actually for you. But who's been the biggest inspiration to you in your life to date?
Oh, definitely my father. My father died back in 1987, but my father was a man of huge integrity. He was a gentleman in the true sense of the word. He had a very, very tough upbringing, tough life in so many ways, born with incredible health issues, born into poverty, a mother who didn't like him. And he had such clarity of values, clarity of how he communicated them, how he bore himself. And I'm still, 30 whatever years later, I'm still hearing him. And I can't say I model myself on him, but I'm still inspired by his example and by what I could only describe as the energy that he conveyed.
That's so lovely. That's so lovely. And I think, like most of us, my parents are one of the biggest inspirations that I have in my life. And you're absolutely right. You can kind of hear their voice in the back of your head, can't you, when you're going about your daily tasks, or sometimes when you least expect it. Well, thank you very much indeed for being on the show today, Joseph. I've been making a couple of notes. I normally do a summary of the call, and actually, there's been a lot of learnings, and I hope that everyone has thoroughly enjoyed the show today with Joseph. I think some of the things that I certainly learned from our conversation is actually when you talk about communication, being able to consolidate your thoughts, and that might mean perhaps taking time out, whether it is, like you said, taking a walk in the park, or having some space away so that you're not so close to the issue. I think emotion does bring about, sometimes some difficulty when it comes to making decisions, and so actually the way to be able to prioritize, as you quite rightly said before, is to actually perhaps listen to what the body is telling you, listen to it if it tells you there is some stress afoot, and actually take some time perhaps for yourself, because if you are to do that, and then also to delegate trust, like you have, delegate work and assignments, and be able to trust those individuals and be able to make clean, solid decisions as to whether they're the right people or the wrong people and what best to do. It's about prioritization and making sure that you put things in that preferential order, probably starting with yourself, not to sound selfish at all, but we must look after ourselves, otherwise it's hard for us to look after other people.
Absolutely. Put on your own oxygen mask first.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much again, Joseph, for being with us today. And for those that would like to contact Joseph, I have your website, I think, just here in front of me. So do visit Joseph at clearsightcommunications.com, or you can check out www.dialglobal.org/podcast or leilamckenzie.com/podcast, and you'll see all of the information there. The show notes will go up, and you'll be able to click straight through to have a look at Joseph's website and also his book. So thanks very much again, Joseph.
Thank you, Leila. Such a pleasure. Thank you.
A pleasure. My name's Leila Mackenzie-Dellis, and you've been listening to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the podcast with you every week. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now. Thank you so much for watching the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please do feel free to hit the like button below, or if you'd like to receive future notifications, do ping the notification bell here at the side. If you're interested in the audio version only, you can find it on the following streaming platforms. Any extra info and descriptions will be in the links below. Look forward to seeing you soon.